They thought they were stopping a threat, but the man they put their hands on was the one man everyone in that terminal was supposed to answer to. Hartsfield-Jackson Airport was alive with the restless rhythm of America in motion, rolling suitcases humming over polished floors, overhead announcements cutting through the air, coffee steaming behind crowded counters, and tired travelers chasing gates with boarding passes clutched like lifelines. Under the hard white lights of Terminal B, everything looked sharp, cold, official, the kind of place where a single glance from the wrong person could turn inconvenience into humiliation in less than a minute. Elias Brooks walked through that world with the kind of stillness that never begged to be noticed. He was a tall black man in his early 40s, dressed in a dark navy suit, carrying a slim leather folder under one arm and a government-issued duffel in the other hand. His shoes struck the floor in calm, measured steps, and his expression never changed, not when people brushed past him, not when a child nearly bumped his shoulder, not even when the first set of suspicious eyes locked onto him from across the security access lane. There was nothing flashy about him, nothing loud, nothing careless. And maybe that was the problem. Some men in uniform only trusted power when it looked the way they expected. Officer Ryan Keller noticed Elias the moment he stepped toward the restricted corridor near Gate 42. Ryan had the squared jaw, clipped voice, and casual arrogance of a man who had worn authority so long he no longer bothered separating it from ego. Beside him stood Officer Mason Reed, younger, quieter, but quick to follow the lead of whoever sounded the most certain. Ryan watched Elias scan the hallway signs, glance once at his phone, and continue toward the marked access point with the confidence of someone who belonged there. That alone irritated him. He stepped forward, lifted a hand, and blocked the path before Elias could take another step. "Sir, this area is restricted," he said, his tone already hardened by assumption. Elias stopped. Slowly, he turned his eyes toward the officer, not with fear, not with anger, but with a level calm that somehow made Ryan sound even harsher. "I'm aware," Elias replied. His voice was low, controlled, unmistakably professional. He reached into his inner jacket pocket with deliberate care. That should have ended it. It should have been a routine exchange, one glance at the credentials, one respectful nod, one quiet apology. But Ryan did not look at the badge right away. He looked at Elias first. He looked at his skin, his presence, the way he carried himself without asking permission, and something in that offended the small kingdom Ryan believed he ruled. Mason shifted beside him as travelers slowed their pace, sensing tension the way people always do in public spaces. A woman near the charging station lowered her phone. A businessman near the newsstand pretended not to stare. The terminal didn't get louder. It got still. Elias held out his credentials, but Ryan did not take them. Instead, he stepped closer, chin raised, posture stiffening for an audience that had not asked for a show. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back and keep your hands where I can see them," he said. For a brief second, the fluorescent lights above seemed colder, the silence heavier. Elias did not move. He looked Ryan directly in the eye and said, with the kind of quiet that makes a room listen, "Officer, you are making a mistake." Ryan Keller had heard those words before from nervous travelers, angry passengers, and people caught where they should not have been, but something about the way Elias Brooks said them made the space around them feel tighter, sharper, charged with a tension no one could quite explain. It was not defiance. It was certainty, the kind that did not need volume to sound dangerous. Ryan let out a dry laugh and looked sideways at Mason Reed as if inviting him into the performance. "You do not get to tell me what kind of mistake I am making," Ryan said, his voice carrying farther than it needed to. "I am the one keeping this terminal secure." Elias did not flinch. His credentials remained steady in his hand, untouched, the seal on the identification card catching the bright airport lights for a brief second before Ryan deliberately looked away from it. Again, that choice did not go unnoticed. A few feet away, an airline employee standing behind the service podium glanced up with growing unease. Near the glass wall overlooking the tarmac, an older man folded his newspaper without taking his eyes off the scene. The air in that corridor shifted from ordinary inconvenience into something far more uncomfortable, the kind of public moment that made strangers stop pretending not to look. Overhead, a boarding announcement called passengers to a flight bound for Dallas, but the words seemed distant now, washed thin by the stillness gathering around the officers and the man they had chosen to confront. Mason cleared his throat and stepped half a pace forward, trying to sound official, trying to sound like this was procedure and not escalation. "Sir, we need you to come with us while we verify your identity," he said. Elias turned his head slightly, just enough to look at him. "Verify it with whom?" The question landed with a weight that made Mason hesitate. Ryan answered before he could think. "With whoever I decide needs to verify it." That was the moment several people nearby exchanged the same look, that silent recognition that something had crossed a line. Elias slowly lowered his hand, slid his credentials back into his jacket, and exhaled through his nose. He was not surrendering. He was observing, measuring, remembering. His face stayed calm, but his eyes sharpened in a way that made Ryan stand straighter without understanding why. Across the concourse, a woman in a charcoal blazer had just stepped out of an administrative corridor, holding a tablet against her chest. Angela Whitmore, the airport operations manager, noticed the cluster of people before she heard any of the words. Then she saw the officers, saw the posture, saw the restricted access point being turned into a spectacle, and began walking faster. At the same time, above the checkpoint archway, a security camera tilted in a slow automated sweep, recording everything in perfect silence. Elias knew that. He knew where every lens sat in this wing of the terminal. He knew which doors required dual authorization. He knew which officers were assigned to the joint response grid this morning and which supervisor had failed to rotate his team after the overnight shift. He had not come here by accident, and he had not arrived unannounced. But Ryan Keller did not know any of that. He only saw a black man in a dark suit refusing to shrink in front of him, and for men like Ryan, that alone felt like a challenge. "Sir, last warning," Ryan said, drawing out each word now, feeding off the eyes around him. "Step away from the access point and place your bag on the ground." Elias looked at the floor for one brief second, then back at Ryan. When he spoke again, his voice was lower than before, almost calm enough to sound merciful. "Officer Keller, in less than 5 minutes, you are going to wish you had read the badge." For the first time since the confrontation began, Ryan Keller hesitated, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for something uneasy to flicker across his face before pride covered it again. Men like Ryan had built entire careers on mistaking hesitation for weakness in other people and confidence for insubordination when it came from the wrong person. He squared his shoulders, lifted his chin, and took one deliberate step closer to Elias Brooks, as if proximity alone could re-establish control. Around them, the terminal held its breath. A little girl standing beside her mother near the moving walkway stopped swinging her stuffed rabbit. A gate agent froze with a scanner in her hand. Even the soft jazz drifting from a nearby restaurant felt out of place now, too light for the weight pressing down over that polished corridor. Angela Whitmore reached the edge of the crowd and slowed, her trained eyes moving quickly from Ryan to Mason to the restricted access sign, and finally to Elias. She did not recognize his face, but she recognized something else immediately. The posture, the stillness, the way he was not trying to explain himself to people who had already decided what he was. She had seen that look before in federal inspectors, military liaisons, and senior officials who carried responsibility quietly because they did not need to advertise it. Then her eyes dropped to the leather folder under Elias's arm. On its corner, partially obscured by his hand, was a small embossed seal she had seen only twice in her 8 years managing airport operations. Her heartbeat kicked once, hard enough to make her stop breathing for half a second. Ryan, however, saw none of it. He saw only the audience, and that was enough to keep him going. "Place the bag down now," he said, slower this time, louder than before. Elias held his gaze, then calmly set the duffel on the floor without rushing, without any trace of panic, as if he were humoring a child who did not understand the game he had wandered into. The movement should have reassured Ryan, but somehow it made him look smaller. Mason bent as if to reach for the bag, but Elias spoke before his hand got there. "Be careful with that, Officer Reed. It contains sealed operational material." Mason stopped instantly. The words hit him differently than they hit Ryan. Operational material was not the kind of phrase anxious civilians used. It was the language of chain of command, formal briefings, rooms with flags in the corner, and people who expected to be obeyed the first time. Mason looked at Ryan. waiting for him to hear what he had just heard. But Ryan only scoffed and waved a dismissive hand. Anyone can say that. Angela stepped forward then, professional smile gone, voice clipped with concern. Officers, is there an issue here? Ryan barely glanced at her. Airport operations, stay out of it. We are handling this. Angela did not move. Her eyes stayed on Elias, then drifted once more to the seal on the folder. Somewhere above them, another camera turned in its housing, red recording lights steady and indifferent. Elias noticed Angela noticing. It was the smallest shift, barely visible, but it told him enough. Someone in this terminal still trusted procedure more than ego. He straightened slightly and looked past Ryan toward the high glass windows that framed the runway beyond, where a jet was pushing back from the gate under a pale Georgia sky. For one brief second, his mind went somewhere else, not away from the moment, but deeper into it, back to the call that brought him here before sunrise, back to the briefing room in Washington where photographs, schedules, and internal complaints had been spread across a polished table. This was never supposed to become public. It was supposed to be observation only, a quiet audit, a controlled test of discipline under pressure. But now the test was no longer theoretical. Ryan's voice snapped him back. Turn around, sir. Elias slowly faced him again, and when he spoke, the air seemed to tighten around every person within earshot. I gave you a chance to do your job with professionalism, he said. Now your supervisors are about to learn how you do it without it. Ryan Keller heard the words, but he did not hear the warning inside them. Some people spend so long mistaking authority for volume that they no longer recognize real command when it stands right in front of them. He gave Elias Brooks a thin smile, the kind that had probably worked for him more times than it should have, and folded his arms as though the terminal itself belonged to him. Supervisors, he said, letting the word roll off his tongue with open contempt. You really think that is going to scare me? Elias did not answer right away. He simply looked at Ryan with the same controlled expression he had worn from the beginning, a look that was not angry, not pleading, not even offended. It was worse than that. It was disappointed. Around them, the crowd had grown without anyone meaning to grow it. Travelers slowed near the charging stations. A man in a Braves cap paused with a coffee in hand. Two flight attendants at the end of the corridor whispered to each other and then fell silent the moment Ryan turned his head. The whole scene had taken on that strange public gravity that happens when people sense they are watching something they will be talking about later, something bigger than a routine delay near a restricted door. Angela Whitmore stepped closer, her tablet pressed so tightly against her chest that her knuckles had gone pale. She kept her voice steady. Officer Keller, I need to know whether Central Command has been notified. Ryan shot her an irritated look. I said we are handling it. Angela did not blink. That was not what I asked. For the first time, Mason Reed looked genuinely uncomfortable. He shifted his weight and glanced toward the overhead camera, then toward the access lane behind Elias, where a red panel beside the door glowed in quiet readiness. He had worked this wing long enough to know that people with sealed credentials did not usually travel alone, and they certainly did not appear in restricted corridors by chance. Something in his face suggested the thought had finally reached him. Ryan saw it too. And instead of calming down, he doubled down. That was always the danger with men like him. The moment certainty slipped, performance took over. He took out his radio, pressed the side button, and gave a clipped request for backup near Gate 42, his tone sharpened by the need to prove control in front of strangers. The response crackled back almost immediately, but before he could answer, another sound cut through the corridor. A phone ringing. Sharp. Official. Unwelcome. It came from Angela's blazer pocket. She stared at the screen and felt her stomach drop. The caller identification showed Airport Joint Operations Command. Not her assistant. Not a routine dispatcher. Command itself. She answered on the second ring, listening for only 3 seconds before the color drained from her face. Her eyes lifted slowly toward Elias. Yes, sir, she said quietly. He is here now. Ryan turned toward her. What is that supposed to mean? Angela did not respond. She could not. Her mouth had gone dry. Across the polished floor, the automatic doors near the administrative corridor slid open and Captain Daniel Hayes emerged with the pace of a man who already knew he was late to something serious. He was still adjusting his jacket as he walked, scanning the crowd, scanning the officers, scanning the restricted lane, and then his eyes landed on Elias Brooks. Everything in his face changed at once. The urgency became shock. The shock became dread. And that dread was so plain, so immediate, that even the people who had no idea who Elias was could feel the shift move through the terminal like cold air. Mason noticed it first, then Angela, then Ryan, who turned halfway toward Captain Hayes with the look of someone expecting support and receiving none. "Captain," Ryan called out, louder than necessary, as if volume might pull the world back into shape. This man attempted unauthorized access and refused to comply. Daniel Hayes did not slow down. He walked straight past Ryan, straight past Mason, and stopped directly in front of Elias Brooks. For one suspended second, nobody breathed. Then Captain Hayes lowered his voice and said the one word that turned the entire terminal silent. "Sir." That single word landed harder than any shout could have. "Sir." It did not echo through the terminal because Captain Daniel Hayes had raised his voice. It echoed because everyone around him understood, all at once, that the balance of power in that corridor had just shifted in a way Officer Ryan Keller had never imagined. The crowd did not move, but something in the air changed. The stairs were different now. A moment earlier, people had been watching a confrontation. Now they were witnessing a collapse. Ryan blinked once, then let out a short, confused laugh as if the scene could still be explained away with the right tone and enough confidence. "Captain, with all due respect," this individual refused to identify himself and attempted to access a restricted corridor, he said. His voice was still trying to sound authoritative, but the edge had thinned. Captain Hayes did not even look at him. He kept his attention on Elias Brooks, the same way a man keeps his eyes on a live wire he knows better than to mishandle. "Sir, I apologize for this," Hayes said quietly. Elias held his gaze for a second, then glanced toward Ryan and Mason as if giving Hayes one final chance to decide what kind of leader he was going to be in front of everyone watching. The silence stretched long enough to make Ryan uncomfortable. Mason did not speak. He had already taken half a step back without realizing it. Angela Whitmore stood perfectly still beside the service podium, tablet pressed against her chest, watching the truth unfold in the exact order she had feared it would. Then Elias spoke, and his calm made the moment heavier, not lighter. "Captain Hayes, did your officers review my credentials when they were first presented?" Hayes swallowed before answering. "I do not believe they did, sir." Elias nodded once. "Did they contact command before escalating the stop?" Hayes hesitated, and that hesitation was answer enough even before he spoke. "No, sir." Ryan looked from one man to the other, still fighting to remain upright inside a reality that had begun slipping away under his feet. He lifted a hand toward Elias, then toward the restricted lane, as though facts were still something he could arrange by pointing at them. "Nobody told us who he was," Ryan said. "Nobody had to," Elias replied. "Professionalism does not begin after recognition. It begins before it." The words hit the corridor with surgical precision. No anger, no speech-making, just truth, clear enough to leave no place to hide. A man near the newsstand slowly lowered his phone. A flight attendant near gate 44 pressed her lips together and looked down at the floor. Even the overhead announcements seemed to arrive softer now, as though the terminal itself understood it had become a courtroom and everyone inside it had heard the ruling. Captain Hayes finally turned toward Ryan, and the look on his face was no longer confusion or dread. It was controlled damage. "Officer Keller, step back immediately," he said. "Officer Reed, do not touch the bag." Mason obeyed at once. Ryan did not move for half a second, and in that half second the truth became undeniable to everyone watching. He had not just challenged the wrong man. He had exposed himself in front of that man, his captain, airport operations, multiple cameras, and a terminal full of witnesses. Elias bent calmly, lifted the duffel from the floor, then reached into his inner jacket pocket and removed the identification Ryan had refused to examine. This time he did not offer it to the officers. He handed it directly to Captain Hayes. Hayes looked at the card, and whatever color remained in his face disappeared. His fingers tightened around the edges as if the paper itself carried weight. When he finally raised his eyes again, his voice was almost reverent. "Joint Airport Security Response Commander Elias Brooks," he said, barely above a whisper. Then he looked at Ryan. "You just stopped the man overseeing the entire operation." Ryan Keller did not speak. For a man who had spent the last several minutes filling the terminal with certainty, Silence looked unnatural on him, like a uniform that no longer fit. His eyes moved from the identification card in Captain Hayes's hand to Elias Brooks's face, then back again, searching for some detail that might undo what he had just heard. But the seal was real. The title was real. The stillness in Elias had always been real. And now, under the unforgiving airport lights, so was the truth. Joint Airport Security Response Commander. The words seemed too large for the corridor, too heavy for the narrow strip of polished floor where Ryan had chosen to turn procedure into spectacle. Mason Reed was the first to lower his head. Not in shame alone, though there was enough of that, but in recognition. He finally understood why every answer Elias had given sounded less like defense and more like documentation. He had not been arguing. He had been observing, recording, measuring every decision as it unfolded. Captain Hayes handed the identification back with both hands, a small gesture of respect that did not go unnoticed by anyone paying attention. Elias accepted it and slipped it into his jacket with the same calm precision he had shown from the beginning. He did not rush to humiliate anyone. He did not raise his voice. That, more than anything, made Ryan look smaller. Imagine standing there, in front of strangers, co-workers, airport staff, cameras, and the very man you had tried to overpower, realizing that every assumption you made had been seen, weighed, and remembered. Angela Whitmore finally exhaled, though it came out shaky. The call from command still echoed in her head. Secure the scene. Do not interfere with Commander Brooks. Preserve all footage. Those were not the words used for a routine misunderstanding. Those were the words used when the system itself was being tested. And suddenly she understood why this morning had felt different from the moment she walked into the terminal. Why certain schedules had shifted. Why command had been unusually quiet. This was never just another day at the airport. Elias looked past them all for one brief second, through the glass walls where ground crews moved in neon vests beneath a pale Georgia morning. Then his attention came back to the officers in front of him. There was no anger in his face, only a fatigue so controlled it almost looked like grace. Captain Hayes, he said, I want the body camera logs, corridor surveillance, radio traffic, and access records from the last 20 minutes preserved immediately. Hayes nodded before the sentence was finished. Yes, sir. I also want a full list of every stop made in this terminal by this team over the past 90 days, Elias continued. Every complaint, every field report, every notation involving discretionary detention near restricted access lanes. Ryan's face changed then, not because he had finally understood who Elias was, but because he had finally understood what this moment was becoming. This was no longer about one stop. No longer about one corridor, one bag, one badge ignored out of arrogance and bias. This was the beginning of something larger, something procedural, documented, impossible to talk his way out of. The kind of reckoning that arrives not with noise, but with paperwork, timestamps, and evidence. A backup unit turned the corner at the far end of the concourse, then slowed when they saw the formation of bodies and the expression on Captain Hayes's face. No one rushed forward. No one gave commands. The terminal had gone too quiet for that. Elias turned to Ryan at last, and the officer who had once stood so tall now looked like a man trying not to drown in his own choices. You were not wrong because you questioned access, Elias said. You were wrong because you decided what kind of man I was before you decided to do your job. The words did not strike like punishment. They settled like judgment. Final. Unavoidable. Around them, travelers began moving again, but slowly, as if reluctant to leave the scene before its meaning had fully settled into place. Somewhere overhead, another boarding announcement began. Somewhere a child asked a question her mother did not answer. And there, beneath the white lights and the quiet stare of cameras, Ryan Keller learned the difference between wearing authority and deserving it. Captain Hayes moved first, and that mattered. In institutions built on rank, silence can be mistaken for strategy. Hesitation can be mistaken for neutrality, and neutrality can become permission before anyone admits it. But Hayes did not leave room for that. He turned toward the backup officers who had stopped several yards away and raised one hand, not dramatically, not for show, but with the clipped certainty of a man trying to contain damage before it spread any farther. Secure this corridor. No one touches surveillance access. No one clears any logs. His voice was firm now, stripped of the panic that had followed him out of the administrative wing. The backup officers nodded at once. They had no idea what had happened in full, but they understood enough from tone alone. Something serious had broken open under the fluorescent lights of Terminal B, and everyone standing there had become part of the record. Ryan Keller looked around as if he had only just realized how many eyes had watched him from the start. It was not just the travelers anymore. It was airport staff, airline personnel, security liaisons, and now officers from his own side of the chain of command, all standing within sight of the very man he had treated like an inconvenience. His jaw tightened. His posture held, barely, but the certainty was gone. Elias Brooks saw it disappear in real time, the way performance always collapses once the audience understands the truth. Angela Whitmore stepped away from the service podium and tapped quickly across her tablet, transmitting the preservation directive to Airport Systems Control. Within seconds, the camera icons above the corridor shifted from passive monitoring to protected retention mode. Every frame from the last several minutes was now locked. Every angle, every gesture, every word caught on body microphones and terminal sensors. Nothing about this scene would depend on memory now. Elias watched the system respond, and for the first time since the confrontation began, the tension in his shoulders eased, though only slightly. He had spent too many years inside institutions to trust outrage alone. Outrage faded. Evidence remained. Mason Reed finally found his voice, but it came out lower than before, stripped of swagger. "Sir, I should have checked your identification when it was presented." Elias turned to him. The younger officer looked shaken, but not evasive. That difference mattered. It did not erase what had happened, but it mattered. "Yes, you should have," Elias said. Mason nodded once, swallowing hard. Ryan said nothing. He could not apologize yet because apology required admitting what had guided him before the badge was ever offered, before the title was ever spoken, before command entered the corridor and forced the truth into public view. Some truths arrive with a siren. Others arrive in the sudden stillness after a man runs out of excuses. A family passing the intersection slowed as they moved by, the mother gently pulling her son closer with one hand while keeping her eyes on the officers. Two businessmen near the moving walkway shook their heads to each other in silence. Farther down, a gate agent leaned toward a coworker and whispered something that ended with the same word now spreading quietly through the terminal like a live current. "Commander." That was the part Ryan could not escape. Not just that Elias had authority, but that he had carried it the entire time. He had not become important the moment Captain Hayes arrived. He had not become worthy of respect when the title was spoken aloud. He had been all of those things from the first second Ryan blocked his path. Elias drew a measured breath and looked directly at Hayes. "Captain, initiate formal incident review under Joint Command Authority," he said. Hayes answered without hesitation. "Already in motion, sir." "Good," Elias replied. Then he added, and his voice turned quieter, almost reflective, which somehow made everyone listen harder. "Today was never supposed to be public." Hayes understood immediately. Angela did too. Ryan did not at first. But Mason looked up with dawning realization. This was not merely an inspection gone wrong. It had been an operation, a test, a controlled evaluation of behavior, restraint, procedure, and judgment in a high-pressure civilian environment. And the men assigned to uphold the standard had revealed themselves the moment they thought no one important was watching. Elias let that truth hang in the air for one beat, then another. Around him, the terminal resumed its motion in fragments, a rolling suitcase here, a boarding call there, a coffee lid snapping shut at a kiosk down the concourse. Yet the center of gravity remained fixed on that corridor. Because everyone knew now that this was larger than one officer making one bad call. This was a mirror held up to a system, and for at least one morning in Atlanta, the system had seen its own face. The consequences did not arrive with flashing lights or raised voices. They arrived the way real consequences often do, through procedure, witnesses, preserved footage, and the sudden disappearance of all the little protections people assume will save them. Captain Hayes stepped to the side and began issuing orders into his radio with clipped precision, each one peeling away another layer of cover Ryan Keller might once have counted on. Body camera retrieval, corridor lock preservation, dispatch transcript hold, temporary reassignment pending review. The words were dry, administrative, almost boring to anyone who did not understand what they meant. But Ryan understood. Every phrase was a door closing. Every instruction was a record being built around him, brick by brick, timestamp by timestamp, until there would be no room left for denial to breathe. Mason Reed stood in silence beside him, shoulders tight, face pale under the cold terminal lights. He looked less like a man waiting for punishment than a man replaying every second in his head, hearing all the moments when he could have stepped in, could have done the job the right way, could have chosen professionalism before fear and loyalty before ego. Angela Whitmore finished her last transmission and lowered the tablet slowly, her expression caught somewhere between relief and shame. Relief that the truth had surfaced before this escalated any farther. Shame that the airport she helped run had become another stage where a black man in authority had first been treated as a problem to be controlled rather than a leader to be respected. Elias Brooks noticed all of it. The shame, the panic, the recalculations happening behind everyone's eyes. But he did not feed on any of it. He did not need revenge dressed up as discipline. He had seen too much of institutional failure to confuse humiliation with justice. Instead, he looked toward the backup officers now securing the ends of the corridor and then back to Captain Hayes. Effective immediately, I want Officer Keller removed from public-facing duty pending formal investigation, Elias said. Officer Reed will submit a statement before end of shift. Airport operations will provide unrestricted access to surveillance archives from this terminal and adjacent lanes. Hayes answered each directive with the same word. Yes, sir. Ryan finally found his voice, but it sounded smaller now, worn thin by reality. Commander Brooks, I did not know. Elias turned to him, and for a moment the whole corridor seemed to wait on the response. That was never the standard, Elias said. You were not supposed to know me. You were supposed to know the job. The sentence cut deeper than anger would have, because anger could be dismissed as emotion. This was principle, clean, precise, impossible to argue with. A hush passed through the remaining onlookers, the kind that comes when strangers hear a truth so simple it exposes everything around it. The older man with the newspaper nodded once to himself before walking on. A young woman near the gate blinked hard and looked away, as if the scene had touched something personal she had no words for. Even the officers at the edge of the corridor stood straighter now, careful with their posture, careful with their silence, aware that this was no longer just a disciplinary scene, but a lesson being written in real time. Elias picked up his duffel and adjusted the leather folder under his arm. Then he looked at Ryan one last time, not with hatred, not even with satisfaction, but with the exhausted clarity of a man who had lived through this kind of moment in different uniforms, different cities, different rooms where people saw the skin before they saw the service. The tragedy, Elias said quietly, is that if I had been nobody to you, I still should have been treated with dignity. No one answered. No one could. Somewhere beyond the glass, a jet engine roared to life and rolled across the runway like distant thunder. Inside the terminal, under white light and watching cameras, the lesson settled where excuses used to live. For a long moment, no one moved to fill the silence Elias Brooks had left behind. It hung in the corridor heavier than any command, heavier than the public embarrassment now burning across Ryan Keller's face, heavier even than the knowledge that every second of this morning had already been preserved in cameras, radios, and written orders that would outlive every excuse made under these lights. The terminal had resumed its motion in fragments, but only around the edges. At the center, near the restricted access point by Gate 42, time still seemed to move differently. Captain Hayes remained standing at attention without being told. Angela Whitmore lowered her eyes briefly, then looked back up with the expression of someone who knew she had just watched a line get drawn between policy and principle. Mason Reed stood with his hands clasped in front of him, no longer trying to appear in control, no longer trying to disappear either. He looked like a man who had just realized that character is not tested when everyone knows who is watching. It is tested in the first 5 seconds, when you believe no one important is there to hold you accountable. Elias adjusted the strap on his duffel, straightened the leather folder against his side, and prepared to continue toward the secured corridor he should have been allowed to enter from the beginning. Then he stopped. Not dramatically, not for effect, just enough to turn back one final time, as if something still needed to be said before the morning could move on. The crowd sensed it immediately. A few travelers slowed again. A gate attendant looked up from her screen. Even Ryan lifted his head, though he did not meet Elias's eyes at first. When Elias finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried with the calm force of truth that had already earned the room. Every person here wears something that represents trust, he said. A badge, a uniform, a credential, a title on a screen. But trust is not proven when things are easy. It is proven in how you treat the person you think cannot fight back. No one interrupted him. No one dared. The words slid through the terminal with the clarity of glass, leaving every listener to find their own reflection inside them. Ryan looked down at the floor, and for the first time all morning, there was no resistance left in his posture, only the stunned stillness of a man forced to confront the gap between the officer he believed himself to be and the one he had shown the world. Elias did not linger on him. That was never the point. He looked instead at the officers securing the corridor, at Angela, at Hayes, at the travelers who had watched this unfold, and then beyond them all, toward the wide windows where aircraft moved across the tarmac under the bright Georgia sky. He had spent his life serving institutions that promised order, and he knew better than most how fragile that promise became the moment bias slipped into procedure and ego put on the clothes of authority. But he also knew something else. Systems do not change because they are embarrassed. They change because someone refuses to let the truth be buried once it is seen. Captain Hayes drew a steady breath and said, almost solemnly, "The review will begin immediately, sir." Elias nodded once. "Make sure it does," he replied. Then he added, softer now, but somehow even more powerful, because dignity is not rank. It is the minimum. The line settled over the corridor like a final ruling. A mother near the moving walkway squeezed her son's shoulder as she passed. The older man with the folded newspaper gave one quiet nod before disappearing into the flow of passengers. Angela Whitmore turned and began coordinating the next steps with a focus sharper than before, as if she understood that accountability was not a moment, but a duty. Mason Reed remained where he was, absorbing every second of it. Ryan said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Elias Brooks then turned and walked toward the restricted corridor, and this time no one stepped in front of him. No one questioned whether he belonged. No one mistook composure for weakness or black skin for suspicion. The doors opened with a soft mechanical sound, and he passed through them without looking back. Behind him, the terminal slowly found its voice again, announcements returning, footsteps resuming, coffee cups clattering, wheels rolling over polished floor. But something had changed in that place, and everyone who had seen it knew it. Because that morning, under white lights and watching cameras, a man did not have to raise his voice to prove who he was. The truth walked in quietly, and authority bowed to it. And the ones who judged him before they knew his name were left standing in the silence of what they had revealed about themselves.